Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Natural Super Kids podcast, or welcome for the first time if you are a first-time listener. A big welcome to you. Today, we are focusing on celiac disease and specifically our naturopathic approach to celiac disease, which is quite a bit different. It involves a few more steps than what you might hear from your GP or medical professional. Now, if you missed last week's episode, I talked about the testing and diagnosis of celiac disease. So if you're interested in learning more about that, make sure you go back and listen to last week's episode. Some of you may be here because you already have a diagnosis. I mean, the testing information still could be interesting to you. But in today's episode, as I said, we're focusing on the approach that we have here at Natural Super Kids to celiac disease. And I think this is such an important thing to talk about, because if you get diagnosed with celiac or your child gets diagnosed with celiac, obviously the advice is that the key advice is to make sure you strictly remove gluten from the diet. And yes, this is important, and this is a forever thing if you have celiac disease, because gluten is very damaging, can cause a lot of damage to the gut, and it also, sets off an immune reaction for people with celiac, which we're going to be talking about in a moment, in terms of immune regulation being one of the important steps that we want to support in anyone with celiac disease. But removing gluten from the diet is only part of the picture. So today I want to talk about the importance of screening for and correcting any nutrient deficiencies. I want to talk about supporting immune regulation, supporting the gut microbiome, and healing the gut as well. Really important, because by the time someone comes to a celiac diagnosis, there's usually been quite a bit of damage done to the gut. So removing gluten, yes, the gut will heal and repair over time, but there are so many things that we can do to improve that. And this is especially important in children, where that absorption of the nutrients that they are getting in through the food they eat, perhaps supplements, is going to be compromised when there is gut damage, and that can definitely affect the absorbability of nutrients. And of course, with kids, nutrients are important for everyone, but for kids that are going through growth and development and have higher nutritional needs, this is really, really important. I guess the positive in terms of a child being diagnosed with celiac is generally there's been less damage to the gut because that they're younger, and it's been picked up potentially earlier. So let's talk first of all about screening for nutrient deficiencies. This is really, step one. I mean, these things that I'm going to be talking about don't have to be done in a certain order. And for each individual person, we may prioritize one over the other or have a different order of them. So they're not in any particular order, but screening for nutrient deficiencies and replenishing those nutrients where indicated is super, super important. So many people with celiac disease have nutrient deficiencies, and the interesting thing is that nutrient deficiencies are common even after, months, even years after the diagnosis is made of celiac disease. Potentially because of the diet, the typical diet of someone with celiac, which we'll talk about in a second, but also because of the factors that either decrease or increase absorbability of nutrients. So nutrient deficiencies, as I said, very common in people with celiac disease. And the common ones are things like iron, if we have a child, if we're supporting a child here at Natural Super Kids with iron deficiency that we can't get on top of, that, isn't correcting or improving with the things that we normally use, we're, often thinking about celiac disease, because iron deficiency is common in celiac disease. Other nutrient deficiencies include things like vitamin B12, omega-3, vitamin D, calcium, vitamin B6, folic acid, magnesium, zinc. So there's a lot of nutrients that potentially need to be looked at and corrected in a child that is diagnosed with celiac. I also just want to say this information is really translatable to adults as well. So if you're an adult listening who has celiac or is thinking you may have celiac, this is all very relevant information for you as well. So the thing that we want to do when we're transitioning to a gluten-free diet once we've been diagnosed with celiac is make sure we're not eating a highly processed food. So just highly processed diet. So just because something says it's gluten-free doesn't necessarily mean it's good for us. Yes, it's going to be important to look for gluten-free products if you're celiac, but there's a lot of rubbish in processed gluten-free products. So remember, just because it says gluten-free doesn't necessarily mean it is healthy. And we want to focus, as always, on nutritionally rich whole foods rather than packaged processed foods. So that is really important in terms of getting those important nutrients in to the diet once we've been diagnosed with celiac. And there are a variety of ways that we can screen for nutrient deficiencies in celiac disease. Some of the nutrients, such as iron and B12 and vitamin D, are really easy to screen for in a blood test. And others, there may be some other different screening tools that we might use. Generally, a good quality multivitamin is a good idea for people who have celiac disease, and we can certainly help you in terms of choosing the best multivitamin for your child or for yourself if you have celiac disease, to make sure your nutrient needs are being met. Particularly in those early stages while we're working on gut repair and improving microbiome health and that sort of thing too. Okay, the next thing we want to do, or the second point I want to make, is that we want to be supporting immune regulation. Now, this may seem a bit strange in terms of a digestive disease, but remember, celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder. And so in celiac disease, the immune system is causing the problem with the gut. Obviously that is sparked by gluten, if you like, but essentially celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder. The immune system is, dysregulated, if you like, genetically. But the important thing to know here is that people with any sort of autoimmune disorder are prone or more susceptible to getting other autoimmune disorders as well. So, for people with celiac disease, the later the age of diagnosis, the greater the chance of developing another autoimmune disorder. So that's good news in terms of a child being diagnosed, earlier in their life rather than later in their life. But there are a lot of conditions that are associated with celiac disease, some autoimmune and some other sort of diseases as well. So my point here is that it is important to note that and to be sort of on the lookout for signs and symptoms of other autoimmune disorders. But the more that we can do to support immune regulation and reduce inflammation is going to, improve our chances or decrease our chances of, getting another autoimmune disorder. So some of the common autoimmune disorders that are associated with celiac are things like type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, Hashimoto's, which is a thyroid disorder, certain types of autoimmune arthritis, and there are, others as well. So we want to be aware of this, but we also want to be, doing what we can to support immune regulation in anyone with celiac disease. Or the other common condition that's associated with celiac is psoriasis, which is of course the skin condition. There's been studies to show that psoriasis is much more common in people with celiac disease. So that's an interesting link as well. So back to how do we support immune regulation? Now, one thing we really want to do is reduce overall inflammation. So for someone with celiac disease, removing gluten from the diet is going to be key, of course, but reducing overall inflammation involves so much more than that. And I guess to put really simply, there's so much I could go into in terms of inflammation. We want to try and stick to, that Mediterranean style whole food diet. Lots of fresh vegetables and fruits and nuts and seeds and good quality protein and olive oil, and reducing things like packaged processed food, high sugar food, foods with additives. Doesn't mean you have to be perfect, but if we can stick to that whole food Mediterranean style diet, that goes a long way in terms of reducing overall inflammation levels. The microbiome and the state and the health of the microbiome, which we're going to talk about in a moment, can go a long way in terms of reducing inflammation levels as well. And the other thing that's really important for immune regulation is vitamin D. So vitamin D is something we really want to focus on in kids with celiac disease, adults with celiac disease, anyone with autoimmune conditions. So the ideal range for vitamin D in individuals with autoimmune conditions or immune dysfunction is over 100 nmol per litre. So we really want to be, pushing those vitamin D levels that little bit higher than what is recommended in terms of reference ranges. Look, in kids, it may not, a little bit lower than that is going to be fine. But if we can try and really get those vitamin D levels up close to that 80 to 100 mark, that is going to be ideal. So vitamin D, of course, we can get through exposure to the sun, but we can also take supplements. And for children with celiac disease, a vitamin D supplement is a good idea. Look, most kids can take 400 to 500 IU of vitamin D without any issues or without having their levels tested. I would highly recommend blood test to get vitamin D levels checked in anyone with celiac disease. And a general recommendation is every 25 nmol per litre you are under 100, you want to take 1,000 IU a day. So if your level is 75, you want to be taking 1,000 IU a day. If your level is 50, you want to be taking 2,000 IU a day. But as I said, for most kids, somewhere between 400 to 500 IU a day is going to be very safe, before any testing is even done. The other positive of boosting vitamin D levels is that vitamin D is really important in intestinal barrier function. Vitamin D deficiency has been shown to compromise intestinal barrier function and promote intestinal permeability, which is essentially leaky gut. So we're going to be talking about that in just a second. The other thing about vitamin D is that it helps to improve microbiome diversity. So vitamin D, so many good things for gut repair, reducing any intestinal permeability, which is really common in people with celiac disease, and also improving microbiome health as well as that immune regulation support. So lots of votes for vitamin D for people with celiac disease. Okay, so we've covered immune regulation, supporting immune regulation. We've covered screening for nutrient deficiencies and correcting nutrient deficiencies. The third thing we want to be focusing on is the health of the gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome impacts our immune system And that includes, any autoimmune activity that might be going on in the body, which of course, as I've said, celiac disease is an autoimmune condition. The gut microbiome also impacts the level of inflammation. And as I talked about, that's really important to be regulating the immune system. And these are just, a couple of reasons that we want to focus on microbiome health when it comes to celiac disease. In the research, there is a strong correlation between dysbiosis or imbalance in the gut microbiome and celiac disease. But I guess the tricky thing is what comes first. There's more studies that are needed to determine whether the celiac disease is a risk factor for the dysbiosis or imbalance, or whether the imbalance is the risk factor for celiac disease. But either or, we really want to be focusing on, a healthy microbiome. And as always, I've talked about this multiple times on the podcast before, when it comes to general microbiome health, we want to really be focusing on diversity. So that means lots of species of good bacteria, healthy bacteria, beneficial bacteria within the gut microbiome. The more, beneficial bacteria species we have, the better. And that really is what diversity is all about. So to improve diversity in the gut microbiome, there's really, three things we want to focus on. Number one is variety of plant foods in the diet. The more variety of different plant foods, of different fruits and vegetables and herbs and spices and nuts and seeds and different whole grains we can have in the diet, the better. And, when we're talking about celiac disease and going gluten-free, for example, a lot of gluten-free products are rice-based. So if we're eating the same rice-based crackers, lots of rice at dinner, rice-based cereals, we are not getting a lot of diversity in, the different grains that we might be eating. So we want to be, really encouraging lots of diversity, lots of variety. So we might want to add some quinoa and some buckwheat and some other gluten-free grains in there to improve that diversity. And as I said, variety in fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds. It's not so much about the amount of these plant foods that are going in, but it's more about the variety. Variety in the diet equals more diversity in the gut microbiome. We can also, of course, add in beneficial bacteria through things like fermented foods, lacto-fermented foods, and probiotic supplements. So things like sauerkraut, coconut kefir, to name just a couple of examples. And probiotic supplements can be really beneficial for people with celiac disease as well. So they're just a couple of ways that we can focus on that diversity of the microbiome to improve overall microbiome health. There is some research to suggest that low levels of a short-chain fatty acid called butyrate may facilitate the onset of celiac disease. And butyrate, as I said, it's a short-chain fatty acid, but for the gut to produce butyrate, we need lots of, we basically need probiotics and prebiotics to come together. So the healthy beneficial bacteria with the plant fibers, the prebiotics together, they will produce butyrate. So another reason that, that's so important. Now, I have talked a lot about the microbiome, diversity in the microbiome on the podcast before. So if you're wanting to learn more about this, just go to naturalsuperkids.com and in the search bar, type in microbiome. And you will find lots of resources, blogs and podcasts to learn more about, the importance of the microbiome and diversity in the microbiome. So the fourth thing that I want to talk about, and this really goes hand in hand with microbiome health, is repairing the gut. As I said, by the time someone gets diagnosed with celiac disease, there's often, quite a bit of damage that's been done to the gut by the immune system because of that autoimmune activity that's happening in celiac disease. So for people with celiac disease, eating gluten increases intestinal permeability. And again, I've talked about this quite a bit on the podcast, where the gut wall should be nice and tight. It should contain the contents of the gut in the gut, as opposed to it being sort of permeable and having gaps, sort of like a stocking, so that it can ooze out into the bloodstream. And that is what, leaky gut and intestinal permeability is really common, in the general population, but even more common in people with celiac disease because of the damage that's been done to the gut. So we really want to focus on gut healing so that we can repair the gut and get it nice and tight, those junctions that hold together the gut cells, nice and tight again. So one thing that we can do, we've already talked about, is improving the health of the microbiome. That little piece of information that I shared with you a moment ago about butyrate, that short chain fatty acid, being often deficient in people with celiac disease, that is a nourisher for the gut wall. So if we don't have enough short chain fatty acids, such as butyrate, the gut is not getting nourished, and that makes it more vulnerable to damage and intestinal permeability. So just improving the health of the microbiome and getting in those probiotics and prebiotics is going to be a really good first step to improving and repairing the gut. A few other things that we can focus on. Gelatin is a beautiful gut repairer. We can find gelatin in things like bone broth, and also, we can use gelatin to make things like gummies that we can eat, and get our gelatin in that way. So that's going to be a good way to repair the gut. And then there are nutrients, things like zinc, vitamin D, which we've already talked about, vitamin A, and the amino acid glutamine, which are all really important for gut repair. So look, there are lots of supplements that you can get. There's lots of foods that contain these nutrients as well, but I do highly recommend working with a practitioner. You don't have to take all of these nutrients separately. They may not be necessary for everyone, depending on, your child's individual picture or your individual health picture. So working with a practitioner can, one, help determine what it is that is going to be most beneficial for you, and two, we can really recommend supplements that contain a lot of these nutrients in one combination, so you're not having to take a million different supplements. Sometimes maybe food sources of these nutrients might be enough. So that's the benefit of working with a practitioner, rather than just taking bits and pieces of information from a podcast like this, and going, okay, I need some vitamin A. I'm going to go and grab some of that. I need some glutamine. I'm going to go grab some of that. First of all, you're not sure whether it's needed for you or your child. You don't know what the dose is. You don't know the best form of supplements. So please consider working with a practitioner, and we can certainly help with that here at Natural Super Kids for this gut healing piece, and even all the other things that we've talked about. Don't try and navigate this alone, because it's a lot to try and sort of figure out. But hopefully some of those little practical tips that I've given you can start to implement immediately. And I hope that makes sense in terms of those important pieces of the puzzle that often get missed when you're just working with medical professionals who will just say, just remove gluten. Oh, and we might want to do a blood test to make sure iron and B12 levels are okay. There's so much more to living healthily with celiac disease, and making sure that, nutrients are being absorbed. As I said early on in this podcast, there's research to suggest that people with celiac disease, well after their diagnosis, even that are strictly eating gluten-free, still show higher levels of nutrient deficiencies than other people. And that could be potentially because they're not eating enough of these nutrients in their diet, or taking supplements to kind of fill the gaps. But a lot of it comes down to the fact that they haven't done the gut healing work, so the absorbability of the nutrients they are taking in is not great. So they're not absorbing nutrients. Their bodies aren't able to assimilate and utilize these nutrients, which for kids is so important because they require so much nutrition to grow and develop and do all the wonderful things that kids' bodies do. I hope that has been really helpful for you. Please reach out to us. You can send us a message on Instagram if you have any questions, or you've got questions about booking a consultation or this information in general. We're more than happy to help. And also I have a free gut health ebook that will be really helpful with general gut healing and microbiome health strategies that you can start to implement straight away. So this is our Kids Gut Health ebook. We'll make sure the link is in the show notes so you can download that and get started with some of those recommendations that are really important for overall microbiome health and gut health in kids, and especially important if a child has something like celiac disease. But please think about getting some professional support if your child with celiac, is struggling and you're wanting to make sure they are as healthy as they possibly can. Thank you so much for listening, and I will be back in your ears next week. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.